Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be with you today. I am Steve Fuller. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick, and I have now been involved for a few years in this large interdisciplinary project involving unidentified anomalous phenomena, um, formerly known as UFOs and other sorts of alien things related to extraterrestrial life and so forth. And what I want to talk to you about today, and I hope this will be of interest to you, it's not about, as it were, the evidence for UAPs and whether it's likely that they really exist and when we're likely to encounter them. It's not really about the empirical aspect of this, but rather about more the kind of conceptual framework in which we might want to think about this in a way that's productive, regardless of whether UAPs actually turn out to be, in the most extreme case, forms of extraterrestrial life. That, in fact, this is a very interesting kind of topic to think with at a very general level. And one of the reasons why it's a very interesting topic is because it sort of challenges our notions of what it means to be human. And there have been many challenges to our notions of being human. And of course, what all these challenges typically involve has to do with facing the other, right? Something alien to what we regard as human. And very often that form of otherness or alien comes from something about ourselves that, in a sense, we find strange. And so very often, the kinds of beings who we regard as alien are, in fact, other Homo sapiens, but ones who have different cultures, ones who look different, have different races, different religions, different ideologies, and so forth. And this has been something that has very much kind of beset humanity from the beginning, you might say. In other words, humans, you might say, do not naturally recognize each other. Okay, so there's always been in the history of humanity a problem of recognition, uh, and um, and so and this is quite a profound issue because when you think about it, the idea that all human beings are the same kind of creature, Homo sapiens, right, a kind of upright ape, is something that only comes from the mid 18th century. And prior to that time, human wasn't the name of a noun, but it was an adjective or a predicate, we might say, right? Which is to say that something is human, something becomes human. There's a sense of a humanizing process. And so we talk about things like the humanities as a form of disciplines, right? We normally think about them in terms of things like history and philosophy and the languages and art, right? That these are disciplines that, in a sense, make us human. So, even so, before the 18th century, the notion of human wasn't very well settled, even from the standpoint of simply identifying an object. And of course, what was generally accepted prior to the 18th century was that the human was some kind of animal. But the specification of the human as an animal, namely as an ape, really only starts to get taken seriously during the period of European exploration around the world, right? To what becomes kind of the forebears of colonization and imperialism and all that. So it is only when the Europeans start to visit in a serious way places like Africa and Latin America and Asia that, in fact, the Europeans see apes. And then not only that, they see beings that look rather like themselves living amongst these apes, and they don't see all that much of a physical difference between them, right? They kind of see them as a kind of somewhat similar, and even the way they behave is somewhat similar. And so it's actually against the backdrop of that in the mid 18th century, Linnaeus, the man who is known as the great taxonomer, right, actually starts to label human beings as Homo sapiens, and this becomes extremely important in the history of human self-understanding. because basically Linnaeus establishes in a very clear, concrete way the idea that the human being is physically an ape, but has a soul. And that's the interesting thing, right? That the human looks exactly like an ape, reproduces like an ape, has almost all the same physical characteristics as an ape with a few variations, but nevertheless, the human has this very special thing called the soul. And the soul, as it were, is where the humanity resides. And the notion of soul, as we move into the 18th century, which, as you know, is the period of enlightenment, all these ideas get secularized. And so we start talking about things like consciousness, and we talk about reason, and we talk about these kinds of things that, in a sense, are designed to set apart humans from other animals who they otherwise look like. Now, of course, Charles Darwin is you might say, the great beneficiary of this point of view, and Darwin's view, of course, is very much taken for granted in the way in which we talk about psychology and other kinds of forms of trying to understand the way in which human beings operate in the world. Now, I say all this by way of introduction because one of the things that it shows is that there has always been a kind of ambiguity of what the human is. And it's only in relatively recent times that we've actually had a very kind of concrete, consolidated notion of what the human is. And of course, as you know, right, thinking about the way the world has been since the mid-18th century, it's actually taken a long time, for example, for not only men but women, not only whites but blacks and other races, right, not only Westerners but non-Westerners, to all be properly incorporated into the category of human, even after there was this kind of general recognition that the human is this upright ape with a soul. Okay? So the point here is that when we start talking about aliens, and aliens from other planets, in particular, other galaxies probably, right, if such things exist, that in a sense, this is a continuation of a process that has always been very much with us. It's just now the test cases are going to be more challenging in the future in terms of what qualifies as a human. And again, it's not a great leap, let's say, from the issue of trying to figure out whether certain kinds of apes are human, right, to talking about ET, right? There is an intermediate phase, which we are already experiencing. And of course, that has to do with artificial intelligence. And of course, artificial intelligence, in a sense, from the standpoint of human psychology at least, has the advantage of being something that humans have created. But nevertheless, the kinds of things that humans have created, right, have in a way become humanized or are increasingly humanized. And to a large extent, it's even part of the design of the project, right? In other words, to create alien beings with whom we can relate in a human way, potentially, starting at least at the level of cognition and rationality, social interaction, and perhaps even kind of deeper psychological and emotional attachments. This has already been on the cards, at least since the 1950s. And of course, we are now reaching a point where people are taking quite seriously the extent to which these artificial intelligences are conscious, are rational, all the rest of it. And these are things that we have created. And of course, this raises all the kinds of questions I've just been talking about with regard to the boundaries, as it were, of what it is to be a human. So the discussion of artificial intelligence that is very much with us, including, I would say, right, the issue of existential risk. Because as you know, especially in recent years, artificial intelligence has been one of these things where people have been very impressed, and rightly so, about the degrees of intelligence and rationality and consciousness that these machines have developed at our own hands, often producing things and behaving in ways that surprise the programmers and the creators. But nevertheless, as that has gone on, at the same time, there has been this sense of existential risk. Namely, might these things become super intelligent, where the idea is that somehow if it's super intelligent, it has the power to destroy us. And I think that's a very interesting kind of elision, you might say, where the way people talk about artificial intelligence, because it's quite similar how often, especially in the science fiction context, people talk about extraterrestrial life, right? Namely, that if we were to discover life that we would recognize as being more intelligent than us, that therefore they would propose a kind of existential risk to us. I personally do not believe this would necessarily follow. And in fact, there's some interesting arguments to the effect that in the case of artificial intelligence, if they were so intelligent, they would recognize us as the creators, and therefore they would treat us perhaps as ancestors or parents, in other words, in a relatively benign fashion, even if they don't treat us as equals. So there is that argument on the table already. And of course, if we're talking about extraterrestrials, right, who have a kind of independent origin from us, if there is some sense in which we would be able to identify that there is a common ancestry, right, that in some sense we're siblings, right, or cousins in some kind of genealogical way of the same creator, then of course that would mitigate a lot of the sense of risk and anxiety that is created by facing the other. So I do think, right, all of these precedents that we have of humans dealing with the others, either others within their own species or others of our creation, puts us in a relatively good position, I think, to think creatively, right, and not purely defensively about extraterrestrial life and extraterrestrial intelligence. Okay. Now, I want to also introduce a little bit of philosophy to this because philosophy, in a way, also prepares us for this kind of wider horizon that I'm talking about here. And here I want to introduce a phrase which you are probably familiar with in some context or other, and that is the term cosmopolitanism. Okay, which literally comes from the Greek, right? And it means a citizen of the universe, a citizen of the cosmos, right? And the idea is to imagine the universe as one big city, right? And we are all citizens. And so this idea is normally seen as coming from the Stoics, the Greek Stoics, the ancient Stoics, and it's a very interesting kind of concept in terms of its origins. Okay. Because the origin of the idea of cosmopolitanism was actually, because let's start this way. When we think about cosmopolitanism now, we normally think about it in a term, to use a term that Peter Singer, if you know Peter Singer, the great animal rights theorist, right, great animal rights philosopher, he talks about expanding the moral circle. Okay. And what he means by that is, as it were, attributing, moral sensibility and feeling moral obligations to animals, at least animals with nervous systems, right? So in other words, you're expanding the circle beyond Homo sapiens to other sentient creatures, right? And this is something that he's been promoting for the last 50 years, basically, is this idea of expanding the moral circle. And of course, you might think about cosmopolitanism that way, right? So in other words, we start, you might say, okay, I have this kind of feeling and this kind of sensibility toward the people I know in my city, and then maybe to people in my country, and then maybe people in my world, right? And then we can move out to the cosmos from then, right? So it's a constant expansion of the moral circle. However, if you go back to ancient Greece and you look at the roots of this idea in the Stoics are in fact bouncing off an idea that would have been familiar to Socrates and all those people in the period of ancient Athens, and it was largely associated with the Cynics. Okay, the Cynics. And we have this word cynicism, of course, that continues to this day. Now, the key thing about the Cynics that's relevant to cosmopolitanism is that the Cynics used cosmopolitanism as a kind of opposition term to being a citizen of the city, right? So in other words, the Cynics, found the whole idea of being a citizen in the normal sense, in the kind of political sense, as too narrow, too restrictive, and too parochial, and involving too limited a sense of how they relate to the world. Okay? And that is one of the reasons why the Cynics famously excluded themselves from civic society, right? They lived in the outskirts of Athens, and famously they were thought to live among dogs, right? And live outdoors. And indeed, the word cynic is related to the word for dog in Greek, right? Where in Latin we get the word canine, right? It's from that same sort of root. And so the Cynics saw cosmopolitanism as a citizen of the world in a sense that broke away from, right, the city of the polis, the Athens, right? And that's an interesting way to think about this. And the Stoics definitely had this. Now, the reason why I'm raising this point is because part of what we may need to do if we are going to have an adequate encounter with the other in this very radical sense that extraterrestrials can pose to us, is that in some sense, we have to abandon some of the things that we take for granted and, as being part of who we are, part of our own identity markers, which once we confront the other will lead us to think those identity markers of ours are too parochial. They're too limiting. Right? They do not open ourselves enough to the possibilities of the other. Okay? And this is where the Stoics are coming from with cosmopolitanism. Now, part of this had to do with the fact that the Stoics, they're very interesting figures. I mean, nowadays, again, some of you may know about the Stoics, especially in terms of their moral philosophy. In fact, their philosophy was regarded as one of the great therapeutic philosophies of the ancient world, right? Along with Epicureanism and skepticism, right? And these philosophies were not just epistemologies, they weren't just metaphysics, but they were ways of, as it were, integrating a general understanding of the world into the conduct of personal life. That's what made them therapeutic, right? So in a sense, you could use these philosophies in some way to direct your life. And so the Stoics had a very particular way of thinking about the world in which we were operating. And it was one where it was a kind of a very unified world. It was a world, first of all, it was a world where everything is material. Okay, so it's a materialistic world. But it's a world where everything is also interconnected. And there's a sense in which there is existence that can be understood along many different dimensions, right, simultaneously. And I think that's very important, too, that there's a sense in which, there's the very large, the very small, the very far away, the very near. And in a sense, this is the same reality, but being projected along different dimensions. And of course, along those different dimensions, things look different. And so part of what the Stoic idea is that in some sense, you have to establish a standard of some sort, right? This is a point at which you are able to take decisions about what to do, but that will depend on how the situation presents itself to you, okay? And so this is why Stoics were very much the kind of people who were involved in legal activities, judges, politicians as well, where they were in a decision-making capacity, and also in a military context where they were making decisions about life and death and whether to go to war or not and things of that kind, where what you're looking at is a kind of common material world in which one's own fate is implicated, but it can be looked along many different dimensions, and then you, as it were, have to take a decision as to what is the dimension along which you are going to evaluate the thing. There is no straightforward answer to this, okay? It is if there's anything free, because Stoicism is sometimes presented as a philosophy of determinism, and to a large extent it is like that, in the sense that the individual does not have full control over the situations in which they act. Nevertheless, if there is a moment of decision, a moment of freedom, the moment has to do with the terms on which one takes a decision. So famously, the Stoics believed the freest moment of your life is when you take your life, right? Suicide, right? Because there you end it. It's quite clear you are the agent, and you end it, and all these things out of your control are no longer out of your control. You have taken them all into your control, admittedly in a way that leads to self-destruction. So the point here is that Stoicism gives you a kind of an interesting way to kind of think about the extraterrestrial, because it starts with the assumption that we are in fact part of whatever ET is part of, right? We're all part of the same thing. And in a way, the question is not to kind of figure out the other so much in its otherness, but trying to find a standard, a unit of exchange, you might say, right? A form of currency even, right? Within which one can transact, within which one can communicate, okay? That is really what you're looking for here. And that is why, when you look at projects like the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, SETI, right? Or you look at the Voyager golden record, right, from 1977 that was put in that spacecraft that Carl Sagan had a lot to do with, right? When you look at those things, right, they are in a sense trying to send out something that might be used as a kind of standard by which communication can be transacted, right? So in other words, there is no assumption about the character of the otherness that one is confronting. And, in other words, we don't know to what extent they're like us or not like us. But what we do know is we're all part of the common universe. And so part of the communication is, in fact, to establish where the difference is. Okay, so you don't start by being frightened or even welcoming, but you start in this kind of mode, right? Where you're looking for where does the difference make a difference, right? And you might know this phrase, right? The difference that makes a difference. Perhaps you know about this. Right, this or the difference that makes the difference, right? This is a phrase that originally arises in William James, the American pragmatist philosopher, and it's also one that was popularized in the 1950s and 60s by Gregory Bateson, who some of you may know as an anthropologist who was very much involved in the early development of cybernetics. Okay, and this is usually put forward in this context as a definition of meaning. What meaning is. Meaning is the difference that makes the difference, right? So when one is giving out all kinds of signals or signs or whatever, then there comes a point in the transaction of these signs, right, where something crystallizes and you say, aha, this is what's going on. This is what it means, right? That is the difference that makes the difference. In a sense, this is kind of what you're looking for when you're interacting with all these ETs. Now, there's another aspect of Stoicism that I think is quite interesting in relation to cosmopolitanism, and that's the way they thought about this as a kind of ethic, as a kind of mode of conduct in the world. And here I want to raise a topic that does not get raised very much in this literature of UAPs, UFOs, ETs, whatever, and that's the concept of love. Okay, love. You've heard of this concept, I'm sure. And philosophers are always very uneasy about it, probably because they don't experience it very much. But the point is that love is a very interesting concept, and the cosmopolitanism very much focuses in on this. But to get at what I'm talking about exactly, we need to think that in the Greek world, in the classical world, you can identify three forms of love. I'm going to lay down three forms of love. Of course, you might divide things differently, but I'm going to talk about three of them because they're very distinctive, and we're familiar with all of them, I think, certainly the first two. Now, the first one is philia. And that is actually the kind of love that one has for family, right? In other words, there is a kind of, you might say, a sort of preordained or predetermined kind of relationship between people, either because, they're family or maybe they're close associates, they're friends. Right. They're people who you have some regular interaction with. They're people who are kind of part of your scene, part of your life, right? These are the people you routinely have to interact with to get on in the world. And so there's philia, right? And this is the kind of normal, everyday kind of sense of love. It's a relatively, maybe a weak form of love. But the point is there is that, right? And it's what, as it were, greases the interactions between people in the world. And usually there's various ways of authorizing it as well, right? Right. So you say, this is my cousin, this is my mother, right? This is, my friend, right? We have ways socially of recognizing this. Now, then there's this other much more ambiguous notion of love, which is called eros. And eros has to do with a kind of mutual attraction between two people. And in a sense, this is something that's very individual in a way, right? And so erotic love, right, is of this character, right? Where people, as it were, are drawn to each other. And so sex is very closely associated with this. And that is a very, and it's a controversial form of love. It is not only about sex. It can also, one of the things that's interesting, if you read Plato's dialogues, is that eros comes up a lot, and as part of what is going on between the teacher and the student, right, in one of these dialogues, right? So it doesn't have to be sexual, but it has a kind of erotic quality in the way people are attracted to what certain people say. We might associate it with something like charisma, right? It's something of that kind. And that's not something that's necessarily authorized. Sometimes it's not authorized. So that's another kind of love. But the one that I want to focus on that's relevant for cosmopolitanism is agape. Okay? And this is a term that if you've run across, probably in the context of Jesus, when he talks about love, he's usually using this term, agape. And this is a kind of universal love, right? Universal love. And the interesting thing about this form of love is it's quite different from the others. And Jesus makes a big deal about it, and it's quite relevant for cosmopolitanism because it's the love of strangers, right? So if you recall from the New Testament, right, the Good Samaritan, right? The Good Samaritan's this guy who's on the road. He sees an injured person, right? And everybody's passing this guy by because I believe he's a kind of an outcast person. Nobody wants to deal with this guy. He's wounded, he's injured, whatever. And this Samaritan helps this guy, doesn't know who this guy is, knows that other people won't touch him with a barge pole, but he sees in this guy humanity. Right. And so he sees the human in this person in this kind of decrepit position. And so he wants to, as it were, help him for that reason, because he sees the humanity. This is quite important. It's quite a profound idea. And what it relies on, right, is the idea that in some sense you're looking for the love at a much deeper level. Right. So it's not the attraction of the person. right? In fact, these strangers are repulsive, right? It's not in the fact that it's been socially authorized because they're your relatives or your friends or whatever, and they're socially recognized as people you ought to be hanging around with, right? It's not that. It's something different. It's something much deeper. And so, if you look at the writings of the Stoics, especially the Roman Stoics, right? Because in a sense, Rome was the place where all this Stoicism really became a kind of almost like an official religion. You will see that very often, in order to cultivate cosmopolitanism, people were instructed to actually leave their cities. Right? So, in other words, to actually go elsewhere. This is what Jesus did himself, right? First thing Jesus did when he started his mission was to leave town. Okay. And then he starts roaming around everywhere. Well, this is kind of what is being proposed here as the kind of way you become cosmopolitan is that you travel, you expose yourself to different people, different places, right? And then you are prepared, as it were, to see the humanity all over the place because you are exposing yourself to all of this otherness around you. And so then the otherness, right, becomes something that you can deal with and you can recognize and that you can incorporate into your being. Now, it seems to me this is quite a good ethic if you want to start with a good psychological state of mind when dealing with extraterrestrials, namely that you should be quite open, and receptive to otherness in general. Okay. And so the cosmopolitan ethic was about going out there, and exposing yourself to others. And in a sense, part of what you're doing, right, is not just showing how generous you are. That is not really kind of the issue here. The issue here is testing yourself, right? And so this goes to the point about, about what it is to be human, right? That a lot of our notions of humanity might, in fact, be very parochial. They might be very limiting, but it is only when you face the other and you are forced to confront, am I really giving this guy a fair shake? Am I really, treating this person the way they deserve to be treated? Right? That then you start to question things about your own judgment that perhaps are holding you back from fully appreciating what the other can offer. Okay? So this is so you end up, what you're doing is you're expanding your conception of humanity, right? Now, over the years, as I've been thinking about this, the context in which I have thought about all this most directly has been in the context of reformulating the Turing test. Okay? And so we go back to artificial intelligence for a moment, right? The Turing test is basically a test that was set up by Alan Turing, the mathematician. You're probably familiar with him, back in 1950. And the idea was, how do you set up a test that enables you to tell the difference between a human and a computer when you ask them a question and they both give answers, right? And you don't know which is which. You have to guess which is which, right? That's the idea. So it's a kind of what you might call substrate blind test, right? So in other words, you don't know if you're looking at a computer or a human, right? You're blindfolded in that sense where you're being given answers to questions that you've asked them. Okay. And that's the key thing about the Turing test. And the way the Turing test has normally been understood has been that there is going to be some version of the test that the computer will fail. Right? The whole point of the Turing test is, is that there's some kind of question that only humans can answer, but the machines can't answer, right? That is kind of what the Turing test is going for. And if you've ever watched Blade Runner, there's a very sophisticated version of that test that's used, right, to catch the replicants, right, which are these kind of AI beings, right, that go rogue in the movie. But my view about the Turing test, and we might call this Turing test 2.0, is quite different. Because I think, in a sense, that what you want is you want to figure out how do these beings get to pass it, right? So in other words, you want to take the test as a real test, in a way a bit like a citizenship test. right? Because in a citizenship test, so you're not a native of a given country. You take a citizenship test, right? If you pass the test, you become a citizen. It doesn't matter where you were from originally. It doesn't matter the color of your skin, right? I mean, citizenship tests, right, are usually not set up to say, my God, too many people are passing it from foreign countries. We can't have that, right? No, right? I mean, the idea is that you have a good enough sense, right, of what you mean by a citizen. You, the citizen, you have a good enough sense that you can admit this other person as also being a citizen, even though this person comes from somewhere else, and even though you may never even have met the person before. But nevertheless, they pass the test, right? We go back to this issue of, right, setting the standard, this kind of Stoic idea. How do you set the standard by which you decide to communicate and to incorporate even these others into our world? Okay, so this is the general perspective from which I come to this UAP thing. It's in a kind of spirit of openness, and I think it's not too early for us to think about how this would work in practice. Okay, right? Because we can already imagine. People are already imagining that these creatures, right, are going to be communicating in perhaps very exotic ways. Right? We do have ideas like technosignatures, right, and biosignatures. We have all those kinds of ideas that, in a way, we try to identify in these creatures as indicative, right, or of the places they supposedly come from, as indicative of some kind of level of civilization. We already have those kinds of things. And of course, we're already thinking about the possibility these creatures may be operating in different dimensions from us, at least normally, or in a sense, they might be able to move between dimensions in ways that we cannot. So all of these things, in a sense, are kind of already there as part of the mix for prefiguring our way of understanding the extraterrestrials. So in a sense, we have set up some ways of identifying the kinds of otherness that we would have to deal with in order to set up some kind of common standard with which we deal with each other. Okay. Now, having said that, then let's say we do have an encounter. Right? Let's say we do have an encounter. Now, here I want to begin by talking about the work of Michael Bolander. And Michael Bolander is a professor of global law at the University of Durham in the UK. And he's written the first book on extraterrestrial law. Now, Bolander comes at this from a guy who's been involved in the questions of transitional justice in the former Germany when they was split apart, right? And also Iraq and Kosovo and places like that, right? Where he's been part of these international commissions trying to sort out justice in transitional moments. And so he comes to this, you might say, in a somewhat more suspicious frame of mind than I do, but it's a frame of mind that I think actually most people who have thought about the issue of our encounter with extraterrestrials tend to come with, right? So there is, in fact, a whole lot of people, not a lot, but I would say if you had to identify the kind of people who think about the encounters of our encounters with extraterrestrials seriously as a possibility, right? They usually come from international relations theory. Okay, and I will just mention in passing Alexander Wendt at Ohio State University, who has a book that will be coming out either at the end of this year or beginning of next year called "The Last Humans." And he actually sets out a kind of theory, international relations-based theory of how to deal with extraterrestrials, which is quite sophisticated and is worth reading, I would say. But what I want to talk about here is a couple of ideas that Bolander puts forward. Bolander puts forward the idea, first of all, and is that our encounters with extraterrestrials are likely to be, in the first instance, and that may be the only instance when it happens, as hostile. Okay? So he's imagining a hostile encounter. Now, the thing I would say about this is that even though I don't necessarily believe this, I could see definitely one kind of scenario where this would work, and he talks about this scenario. So, in other words, you could think about the hostility arising, as it were, very directly, right? Like these extraterrestrials, you know, just, want to get rid of us or want to use the planet, right, for purely extractive purposes, right? Because they need our precious minerals, right? So, in other words, we treat, the extraterrestrials treat Earth the way in which Trump treats Ukraine, right? We could have that, right? Or, right, we can imagine this being a very kind of accidental thing, an unintended thing, right? Where in some sense the extraterrestrials are just trying to make contact with us, but the way they communicate, right, is so overwhelming as far as our resources are concerned that they unintentionally obliterate us. Okay? Now that's a possibility too. But let's say neither of those things happen. And let's say that the encounter is, in fact, one where we recognize them and we're trying to make some sense of them. And so he proposes this idea of the Galactic Club. Okay? So the Galactic Club is the following. Namely, we're imagining now that these extraterrestrials make contact with us, and that they are obviously intelligent beings, right? Advanced civilizations and so forth. And they've been hooked up with other such beings across the galaxy, right? Very much like the Federation in Star Trek. And they now run across us finally. And they realize, just based on what they understand about us and our history and our level of civilization and so forth, they realize that we are eligible to join this Galactic Club, right? In that we have reached a certain kind of threshold of civilization. And so they say, okay, so Earthlings, hello, have we got an offer for you? We would like you to join the Galactic Club. And the Earthlings say, whoa, that's pretty interesting. What does it involve? Are there membership fees? Things like that. And the extraterrestrials say, well, actually, there is something you would have to do because we have looked at your Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? This UN thing. We've read this. And we have a couple of issues, one in particular, and that is that you guys seem to place a lot of store by the territorial integrity of the human body, right? You got, and we see the way in which human rights law is enforced on Earth, and it's all about, issues of torture and cruelty and all these things. They are always the things people are brought to court for because there seems to be this kind of inviolate character, right? The inviolate character, right? Sanctity of the body, right? And we just don't buy this in the Galactic Club. For us, the bodies are permeable, interpenetratable, right? They're whatever distinctions there are between one being and another being is purely transient and conventional. There is no very strong sense of identity attached to the human body or any body for that matter. And so, we are material beings, but we have a very sophisticated notion of materialism, right? That in a sense wants to move more with the dynamic flow that we understand to be the constitution of the material universe. And so, you would have to drop this. You would have to drop this sanctity of the body business. So, what do the Earthlings do? Well, it's not obvious. First of all, what's not obvious is whether the Earthlings can come up with a unified position on this. As you know, even when the Earthlings are just amongst themselves with something like the United Nations, they have a very hard time coming up with a unified position on anything. And there we're just talking about Homo sapiens dealing with Homo sapiens. Now you bring in extraterrestrials, and can you get a unified Earth position on this? Not obvious. Okay. And you have to imagine what would be the nature of the discussions that would take place among the Earthlings, trying to figure out whether to abide by this condition. Okay. One of the issues may be, for example, what happens if we say no, right? So in other words, since we are dealing with extraterrestrials who can communicate with us and are relatively peaceful, it seems, right? Nevertheless, we're kind of wondering the extent to which we can say no to this proposition, especially given that all the other intelligent beings in the universe so far have signed up to it, right? Can we just be alone, right, as the only intelligent being in the universe that has this kind of territorial integrity thing for the human body? Well, this is an interesting question, right? Is this something that we would be allowed to do, right? Could we survive that way, right? In other words, in the world where you imagine that there are these so-called superior intelligences from advanced civilizations, if you decide, as it were, to say thanks but no thanks, right, and you decide to just try to carry on as you have on Earth and just sort things out in an Earth-like way, whether you'd actually be able to get away with that, right? This is a very interesting question, right? Because and this is a question, by the way, that is somewhat analogous to some of the issues that sometimes get raised about artificial intelligence once human beings become highly dependent on them. Right? In other words, if we've got artificial intelligences all over the place that to a large extent are already somewhat autonomous in the way they process information and the way they think and all the rest of it, then will we not have to sort of alter our behavior in order to make ourselves more acceptable and compliant with them? Right? So in other words, there could be a kind of role reversal where in some sense we need to be serving them because they now hold the balance of power. Okay. And so this is a kind of a very interesting question. And so Bolander in a way leaves us with this question. But I want to also raise another possibility here. And this is not in Bolander, but in a way it's kind of the flip side of what his thought experiment is. And I want to call this the Galactic Refuge. Okay? And this is in the spirit of our times where we're very much preoccupied with immigrants and migrants coming into countries illegally, blah, blah, blah. And so supposing we find ourselves in the following situation, and this is possible too, right? So, as you know, for many, many decades now, we have in fact been sending out all of these probes and signals and so forth to try to find out, whether there is any other forms of extraterrestrial intelligence. And of course, the way we normally do this, right, is by advertising ourselves, by saying who we are, and usually presenting ourselves in the best possible light. Again, if you recall that Voyager Golden Record from 1977, right, it's a beautiful picture of what humanity is. Okay? Now, one of the possibilities, of course, is that there are all these intelligent creatures out there, but some of them may be in more or less, good situation. Some of them may be in a fairly desperate situation, even though they are fairly advanced. And so they need a place to go to, right? They need a place to take refuge. They need a place to migrate. And so now, having received this signal from us, they say, my God, Earth, this is where we ought to go. This is the place that can save us, right? This is where we should go. So all these advanced creatures, right, get on their small boats or whatever, or their small aircraft, right? And they all come over here. and they say, look, we want to be part of this because where we come from, man, it's a nightmare. We overexceeded our ecological limits. We have done all kinds of crazy things. We've got crazy people running things. You'd be surprised what happens when people get IQs of over 200, right? And they said, we want to come here. We want to come here. These super intelligences want to come here. Now, do we let them in? Do we let them in? And under what condition? Okay? It's a very interesting question. Again, I don't have any clear answers for this, but, what are the considerations that you would raise under these circumstances? Now, obviously, I suppose one of them would be how many of them there are, of course. But you might also want to know, well, can these advanced forms of knowledge or these different evolutionary adaptations that they have developed over the millennia in whatever planets they're from, would these be adaptable to the people on Earth? Or would it be a case that, you just bring in 3 or 4 of these guys and they'll just take over the planet immediately? And so how would you make a judgment of that kind? Okay, so this is a different kind of issue, right? This is an issue, right, where in a sense, there is a kind of ambiguity here about who's doing whom a favor, for example, whether this is going to be seen as a generous moment or a moment of potential threat, right? It is very ambiguous, very much like a lot of the issues involving the migrant crisis. But the point I would say here, and I will end on this, is that insofar as our quest for unidentified anomalous phenomena or extraterrestrials or whatever has been very proactive, right? We've been looking for these creatures. It almost sometimes seems we want to find them, right? Then we have to imagine a scenario where they might want to actually move here. In which case, then what do we do? Do we welcome them with the kind of open arms that the more liberal and transcendent amongst us would, right? Because throughout this talk, with my talk of cosmopolitanism and the Stoics and, openness to strangers and all that kind of thing, it sounds like, yes, we're ready for it. We're open to it. But as you start to think about this as a potential concrete scenario in which, let's say, people advanced civilizations are fleeing their planets and coming here, then it becomes trickier. But that is also just as much a test of our humanity, as the more kind of the more usual ones. And so with this, I will end here. What I would say is that regardless of whether there are these unidentified anomalous phenomena or extraterrestrials, whether we find out about them in our lifetimes or only in 1,000 years or never at all, nevertheless, this is a very excellent mental exercise in trying to conceptualize the limits and the expansiveness of our humanity. Thank you for listening.